All right, we have Dr. Kevin Redmond tonight. He's part of the Parent Cancer Center. We've had folks from there before. And you probably all read about, where's the newspaper article? If you see the Business Courier, they said a big spread about the new Proton beam center up in Westchester. So it's very kind of Dr. Redmond to come down tonight and spend time with us. So he's going to do some stuff and tell us how he became a radiologist. So tell us a story.
Glad everybody's out here tonight. I hope I don't disappoint the crowd here, but unless someone else is going to talk. But just for those of you who didn't read my little bio on the internet, I grew up in Columbus, and my dad was a professor at OSU, he's a nuclear engineering, and he always wanted to have an engineer in the family, and I had three brothers and a sister, and he unfortunately got two bankers, a teacher, and a computer science guy, and then I was the closest he could get as a radiation oncologist, and he doesn't think it's quite good enough. But that's how I got kind of pushed toward the technical things. Then I went to medical school. I always had an interest in cancer because it was really prevalent in my family, no prostate cancer, but a lot of other kinds. And when I went in my fourth year of medical school, I met kind of my mentor was Bernie Aaron, who was the gentleman who founded the radiation oncology department at the university. And then after I met him, he offered me a residency spot, and then after I got out of residency, he asked me to stay on his faculty. So I've been there going a little over 30 years. I was there before there was a Barrett Center. And Bill and John, who you saw in the picture, we've been kind of together we've been at kind of the core group there for about 30 years. I don't really consider myself a prostate specialist. I've treated a lot of prostate cancer. One of the things I was most proud of is I started our clinic down at the VA. So just to show you how times have changed, when I first went down there, they sent me down as a second year resident. And I said, what do I do? They said, we should go down there and see patients. And they said, there'll be a faculty member down there. And I got down there and all the patients showed up and there was no faculty people there. So I just started seeing patients and we just kind of developed a clinic from that. There's a fairly good, there's a doctor down there who's also a mentor of mine, Al Muehlman, who treated the vets for cancer for a long time. And I was there about 10 years and we were doing prostate implants and he said, Kevin, why don't we do that for the veterans here? And I said, well, that's fine. I'd be happy to do it. And Al was a lifetime VA doc and he knew how to tweak the system. And after I said I would do it within a year, he had prostate cancer patients coming from all over the United States to Cincinnati to be treated at the VA. We used to fly them in on Mondays, do their volume study on Tuesdays, we crank out a plan on Thursdays, we do the implant, and on Friday we'd fly them back home. And we did over 1,000 implants in about a 10-year period. And a lot of my impressions of prostate cancer were formed during that time. And one of my things I'll talk about is, I think it's somewhat we are over-treating prostate cancer in a lot of cases. And someone asked me, when did I first think that? And it's kind of a funny story. So I had a guy that flew in, and I used to see him before the implant, right before they'd see the anesthesiologist. And we would talk about, we'd do the volume study, and they would talk to the anesthesiologist. So I would screen them very quickly. And being veterans, there's a lot of comorbidities with heart disease and lung disease. And so the guy was talking to him, and I said, do you have any chest pain? He goes, yeah, I have it all the time. I'm like, oh, my goodness. So I started screening him for coronary disease, and I said, is it like, I don't know if it's stepping on your chest or real sharp? He goes, no, doc, it's really sharp. And I said, well, how often does it happen? He goes, it's happened about 7 times this morning. And I said, really? And I said, what do you think causes that? He goes, well, every time my defibrillator goes off, it hurts. And his defibrillator had gone off 7 times that morning. So obviously him worrying about his prostate cancer was a little misguided. So we sent him up to the cardiac unit and we kind of tuned him up and sent him home without an implant. But you got an idea about what certain people were saying needed to be treated and didn't need to be treated. And so that's always influenced my thinking. As far as my hobby, I did put in there that I was named president of the College Hill Beer Club in absentia. We had a group of guys, our our gals did a book club, and we had nothing to do on the nights that our wives were away, so we decided we should form a beer club. And since they knew I brewed beer, they thought, well, if we make a club and we make him president, we can drink his beer. So this is a club, and this is at my 60th birthday party. And when I say disclosures, you're always supposed to tell people where you get your money from, what's influencing your decisions. Well, nobody gives me any money, so don't have to worry about that. But I am 60, and I'm not checking my PSA. So I'm not a real fan of screening. So this is my son. He's a junior member there.
So let's talk about protons.
So this Proton Center, it's out, I don't know if y'all have seen it, it's out off of, you can see it from the freeway on 75. If you go out in Liberty Township, it's right at the intersection of what they used to call the Michael J. Fox Freeway, the connector to Hamilton. And they've had a outpatient hospital there for a while. And about 9 years ago, John Redmond, who does all the pediatric radiation oncology for pretty much Cincinnati and Dayton, but he approached the people at Cincinnati and said, what would you think about getting a proton machine? It's really probably, its number one indication is to treat children, and wouldn't that be a great idea? And the head of Children's then asked him how much it would cost, and he said, thanks, but no thanks. And at that time, he probably quoted him a price tag of maybe $50 million. All right, so fast forward to 3 years. I believe Cincinnati, we've all seen the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Well, for some reason, Cincinnati was always, they've always been the top 3 in cancer care in pediatrics. They fell out. And it's always been Boston, Philadelphia, Cincinnati. They would always just exchange places in the top 3. Well, they fell out of the top 3. And when they asked why, they said, well, you don't have a proton center. So they called Dr. Brett and said, we need to do a proton center. So we've really began discussions in earnest at that point. And the reason is if you look at the physics of a proton, I won't show you too much of this, but there's something called a Bragg peak. So if you have regular radiation, the highest dose of a single beam is always as it enters your body, usually within 1 or 2 centimeters under the skin, and then it falls off. And you concentrate the radiation by basically intersecting beams like spokes of a bicycle wheel, and you try to put the tumor at the axle. But there's always something that goes out the backside. So there's always something coming out the back, not as much as goes in, but it always leaves. With protons, it goes so far and then it stops. And within a centimeter, there's no exit dose. And so it spares a lot of tissue that you can't do with photons, which is the standard linear accelerator treatment. So what you can do is you can take this peak, but it's very narrow. And with the machine, you can, and by varying the energy of the proton, you can spread this out and treat whatever area you think is necessary. So these are all the Bragg peaks that you can get with your with our machine. This is a depth up to 30 centimeters, which is as big as most people are. So you can select whatever segment you need based on tumor dimension. And just to give you an example why it's important in kids, this is a kind of a standard treatment for something called a medulloblastoma. It's a brain tumor in children that's quite curable, but you have to treat the entire brain and spinal cord. And you can't do it. Chemotherapy helps, but the radiation really is what keeps this from coming back. And you have a cure rate that's probably in the 75% range. Now, with this is the standard treatment you used to do with linear accelerators, and if you come in from the backside, treat the spine, you have all this dose that's going into the belly, into the chest, and when we went to the IMRT area, you could make that a little better and relatively spare. This little blue line is still radiation coming, 3/4 of the way through. And this is what you can do with protons. You can tell that beam to stop on a dime. You can tell it to stop in the middle of the bone, but a lot of times in pediatrics, if you treat a part of the bone, you want to treat the entire bone because otherwise they'll grow asymmetrically. But you spare all this tissue that you don't need to treat. And this is it's a little more if you look on the axial. So here you're treating the entire spinal cord and the vertebral body. You're totally missing the heart. You're totally missing most of the lung. And why that's important is when you have a pediatric tumor where your cure rate can be up to 80, sometimes even 90%, all those children are going to grow up, they're going to become adults, and they're going to have long-term toxicities of radiation. And the long-term toxicity they worry about the most is second malignancies. So a lot of these kids, we cure them only to have them to go on and develop a breast cancer at a very early age, a stomach cancer, a lung cancer. You pray they don't smoke, but a certain amount will, and all those risks add up. And so this is why it was so important for children to get the proton machine. So when they came to us and said, we'd like to do it, we were like, sure, we'd love to do it. I mean, radiation oncologists love their toys. And nothing is better than a $120 million toy under the Christmas tree. And children said, we'll come up with the first 100 million. So that was the deal that was basically went to our department and to University Hospital. So this is the layout of the Proton Center. So it was such an expensive building, they figured they had to put something else with it. So there's also a leukemia center that's up on the second floor, which is above this area. All the radiation treatments are given right here, and we'll kind of go over, I got some pictures. And then they also, and children's, when they go in big. They said, well, if we're going to have the Proton Center, we should have the best Proton Center in the nation. And they really ponied up, and we've got the Cadillac. I mean, it is an amazing machine. They also included areas that they wanted to have research. They have a gantry that's totally devoted to research. Nobody has that. They put an area for, and this gantry will probably open up in the spring to go through how it's coming along. And an area for experimental animals. I mean, we were like, wow, these people know how to do it. So this is another schematic of it. But you see all these big, these things that look like cones coming out there? Those are the treatment gantries. Each one of those gantries is housed in a room that is essentially 4 stories high. When you go into the treatment area, you're going into a false floor, and there's 20 feet below you, at least 20 feet above you, and if you could look behind it, you'd see these massive magnets directing the proton beam and how it can direct things. So it's a huge investment. So when it was built, it was the biggest concrete pour in the state for like 3 years. And I went there once where they just had everything, all the conduit, everything, and you just couldn't even believe that anyone could even engineer it. It was so complex. So this is the hospital that Children's has over there, and this was the excavation for it. So this is where all those clinical buildings are, and then this is the pit that they put in to house the gantry areas that are essentially 4 stories tall, so they're kind of 2 stories down and 2 stories up. And this is the concrete pad. These are each one of the gantries where they're going to set it in. And then the last thing is the thing that runs it. And this is just them building it up, and so you can kind of see the full effect of it. But this is basically the guts of a proton machine. It's the cyclotron. It's the thing that accelerates the protons. So how they do that is, anyone guess how heavy this is? If you read the article, you might know. 90 tons. It is nothing but solid. It's a super cooled iron magnet. So they finished the building to a point. It was interesting. So Varian is an American company, but they build these things in Germany. So when we were discussing who we buy it from, and Varian's is the Cadillac. And so we talked to various companies, and finally Children said, we're going to have the best. We're going to spend all this money. We're going to have the best. And it was over. So you have to figure out how you're going to get this over from Germany. And they looked at 2 routes. One was they were going to float it up the Ohio, come up through New Orleans and up. And they thought it was fine, but then they figured out they could make it all the way to the riverfront, but they couldn't make it from the Ohio River up to Liberty Township. So then they decided they would bring it in through Baltimore, and then you have to bring it on through the freeway system. The interesting thing is on the way there, they had to negotiate all sorts. You had to come close to almost shutting down the freeway. This thing was it was not just like a wide load, it was like a double wide load. And I don't know if you can see this truck that it's on, but it just really doesn't represent how wide it is. And what they found out is when you come from Baltimore to Ohio, one of the states said you couldn't do that except in the daylight. You couldn't do it at night. And then the state right next to it, I forget which one it was, said you was the other way around. You could do it at night, but you couldn't do it during the day. So there's all sorts of logistical things that they had to work out, but they did. And this is how you get it into the building. They had a crane that they, I think there were some traffic jams on 75 the day they did this. So you're dropping this 90-ton thing just right down into the roof and into the core. And it came right down through this hole in the roof. And this is the room that it's housed in. So they specially purify the water in Germany. They import the water that they use in the cyclotron because it has to be ultra pure. And the protons are basically the hydrogen atoms. They strip them off the water molecule. That's how they started. And so here's the cyclotron, and it's constantly churning, and then what it does, it directs a beam down the entire backside of the building. Now, one of the cool things was if you got there when they were building it, you could actually go back there. Now, there's some places in the building where I can't get to, so I'm glad I got to see it. And this is the cyclotron in place. You can see how really tall it is. And it's massive. It's nothing but a solid iron core. It's super cooled magnet.
How thick aren't those walls, 4 or 5 or 6 feet?
Oh yeah,
thick?
that's why the concrete pour was so massive. Because it's a single-story building on one side, and it goes 4 deep in the bunkers, and everything is just totally shielded by with concrete. And you would not know there's anything. You could have a meter outside the door, on the outside of the building. You would not know anything was there. I mean, they were right next to, I think, Lakota High School or something. And
East.
so this is what happens. So there's the beam, and you could, even though you can have, so we have density, we have the research gantry, we have the adult, we have the children, and this is the 4th one. That was going to be an extra $12 million. And they thought, well, let's see how it goes and see if we need the 4th bay. I think they wish they would have had it because I think it's going to get busy quick. But this beam is constantly going down this back hallway, so to speak, you constant stream. And then you can only treat one person at a time. So if the beam is on, it gets diverted into the room where the patient is. Now you say, well, why would you have 4 rooms? Well, a typical proton patient is in the room for up to half hour to an hour, depending on how complicated the setup is. And most of that time is taking diagnostic quality films, CT scans, to ensure that the patient is in the perfect position. And then you turn the machine on for 2 minutes. So if you stagger this right, no one ever wasted the beam because the actual beam requirement is a percentage of time in the room is very small. So again, they have a children's gantry, adult gantry, research, future, and children's was, I mean, they're very interesting. I did a little bit of children's radiation oncology early in my career, but we had to split up and John kind of took that over. They're a very interesting organization. So they definitely wanted a children's side and an adult side. And they were very, very specific. We thought, well, we as a department, we just float all over the place, And we thought, well, if there's some extra time in the child's gantry and we got a bunch of people backing up, they said, oh no, that's the kids' gantry. So we'll see how that works. But I also tell them, they also were in charge of the decoration at each side. And I'll tell the residents when they go up there, I said, it's kind of like, the Wizard of Oz. You come in on the Kansas side in black and white, then you go over to Oz, it's all in color. So it's and again, just another schematic. I borrowed some, so I didn't. So it is the only research proton gantry in the United States, in the world actually. So what are we going to do with that? Well, there's a lot of things about proton treatment that we don't know, particularly this level of proton treatment. Protons have been around probably 20, 30 years. The one in this area that was original was the one at IU. And what they did is they took an old research accelerator and they modified it for patients. And so they basically had one beam and they basically had to move the patient around that beam. This is totally different. Here the patient's always laying on a table and the beam moves around the patient. So this is the area that you can't get to anymore. This is the proton accelerator run. So this is the cyclotrons over here, and these particles just shoot down here. And these are the series of magnets that keep it contained and also diverted into the gantry when treatment is needed. I just put a bunch in here just to show you how just complicated it is. It's an engineering marvel. My dad'd be happy now I mentioned engineering. So each one of these are all the bays that they divert into. And again, just another look at that. I couldn't decide which is the best, so I put it on. So this is the bay, this is the treatment bay. So if you're ever there, the patient comes in, this is the door that they come in. And there's a floor there, and then down here are these massive magnets that shape the beam, and it goes up just as high up there. And the advantage, and what makes this machine hopefully so useful, is this is the gantry that they put in the room. So this whole thing rotates. So if you've ever seen a regular radiation machine, they rotate around you. Well, this does the same thing, except the rotation arc is about 2 stories. And this is what it looks like. These are some of the neurotumors that they're treating with. This is the cone where the proton beam comes out. This is what they call a 6-degree of freedom couch. So it can move patients XYZ, pitch, yaw, and rotation. So however the patient is set up, they can automatically, so what they do is when they put the patient in, now for pediatrics, these patients we have an on-site pediatric anesthesia team that starts 7 in the morning. And part of those rooms there are just for pediatric patients to be put to sleep. And they come in because and the whole team is there. I mean, the first time we did anything was kind of like that Marx Brothers movie where everybody was kind of crowding into the room, and finally they open the door and everybody spills out. I mean, it felt like that. There were so many people there. And so they get placed on the table, and then we have 2 ways of localizing the patient. One is this whole cone, and you can see how it wraps around. So this is a false floor, so when the cone rolls down, this floor kind of goes away. Same thing up top. But these are orthogonal x-rays, so they can take orthogonal x-rays, crisscross, and then they can have a computer program that will tell the technologist how each one of those 6 range of motions should be to align patients within a 1/10 of a millimeter. Very exact. And in addition to that, and I don't know where it is on this picture, but there's also a cone beam CT. So if you want to, you can do an entire rotation and then get a reconstructed CT scan and then overlay that to where you want the patient to be. So it's very famous. This is where the technologists stay only during the setup time. So this will shield you from diagnostic x-rays, wouldn't shield you from protons. And these are some of the things that they think they do on the neuro end. And neuro is easy because your brain is encased in a fairly reproducible box, your skull. And you can fix that very easily, and it doesn't move, and it doesn't get any air or liquid that isn't there all the time. Those are real bugaboos with proton treatment. So when I said we got the Cadillac, the proton story is kind of similar to the photon, is that what we have now is the IMRT equivalent of proton beams. It's called proton beam scan, pencil beam scanning. So it started off where they would, this is kind of first generation, and you see how this is second generation on prostate, and you can see it's not really that tight. And then they got to where they did unifocal scattering, and then this is pencil beam. And they say the best way to describe pencil beam treatment is the beam comes out like you would have a 3D printer outline a tumor. And if this works, I hope it does. So this is your tumor. And that's how it treats. Layer by layer, it just paints it. And you have magnets guiding that the whole way. And the whole time, it's picking the energies to make the beam go that far and stop and don't treat the next layer down. It's incredible. It's also very expensive. So we have to decide when is this worthwhile to do. So the building is complete. We now have one gantry that's functional. It's treating entirely pediatrics this time. The adult gantry will be up sometime after the first of the year. We have some adults who are already treating on the pediatric side, but once they become both, they'll kind of split. The third gantry, the physics gantry, or the experimental gantry, will open in March. Yeah, and then remember, Kansas odds. So this is just to give you an idea of what you can do with prostate. Now the thing about IMRT with prostate is you get fairly conformal dose around the gland, but you get a lot of wash all the way around. And the question is eliminating that kind of low dose zone of 10 gray, 20 gray, 30, 50% of the dose, is that really worthwhile in someone my age? How is this going to benefit me? Because we've been treating prostate with radiation for a long time, and actually with fairly good results. But this is what you can avoid. This is just a very simple beam coming from each side. Your dose to the femur is actually less than this. Your bowel and bladder are spared very well. So this is kind of what we look at. This is what we call a dose volume histogram. So this is the squares represent the dose from a photon treatment, and the triangles are the proton. And this is the yellow are bladder. So this is the rectum, and this is the prostate. So you can see the dose of the prostate really isn't that different, but this gap here between this area is all bladder that is being avoided. And so you would hope that would help with side effects. So we're going to go back in history a little bit about how the technology has progressed in radiation treatment for prostate cancer. There's no slides of this because it was so long ago, but when I was a resident and we treated prostate cancer, you wouldn't have liked it. Because what we did is we just were beginning to have CAT scans. Sometimes we would treat people without CAT scans. And what we would do is a guy would come in, and I'd be the resident, and I'd have a catheter, and I'd put it in, and we'd put contrast in it. And we would, and with the balloon, we would identify where the floor of the bladder was, and you could see where the catheter bent. That was where the prostatic urethra went into the penis. So that gave you your measurements. If you had a CAT scan, you could then measure around that and decide how much of the area around that catheter needed to be treated. And then at that time, everybody got whole pelvis radiation. So you get 5,000 rads, 5 weeks of whole pelvis radiation. Everybody got diarrhea. I mean, not just a little bit of diarrhea, like 8 pills of Imodium a day diarrhea. And they would get exhausted. And then after the 5 weeks, you would come, what we said would come down, and then you would basically set the linear accelerator to wherever you thought the prostate was, and the linear accelerator would literally bounce like this laterally, and a beam would just constantly be focused on the prostate. Seemed really high tech at the time, but it wasn't. So the next improvement was 3D conformal radiation. That's where we actually integrated data from CAT scans into prostate cancer treatment. So we would draw the area that we wanted to treat, it's a big prostate, and we would then bring beams in from a variety of different directions. And this actually was really a quantum leap forward in the technology, in the sense that the side effects decreased by 90%, the acute ones, the diarrhea in particular. So, and at the same time, and this kind of muddles the waters a little bit, is that we were getting onboard imaging that was good enough that we could see the prostate before every treatment. And we could recognize how many times we were missing it. The assumption always was that the prostate didn't move in your body. And the answer is, it does. And so unless you have some way of adjusting daily, at least with the prostate, there are certain days that you're not getting full dose. And where's that full dose going? It's going in your bladder. It's going in your rectum. So this was a big step forward. But you can still see we get a little wash here in the femoral heads. This is the 30%, 50% zones. And then when you get to really to the 70, 80, 90, it's all around the prostate. This was the next step that we improved on. We had a machine that was called a TOMOTHERAPY unit, a very interesting machine. It was a linear accelerator mounted on a spiral CT ring. So you would put somebody in the machine and the thing would just spin around and the shutter would open and close, and you could get, through a very clever computer program, you could get really tight doses all the way around the prostate. You see how to hit the back of the rectal wall would be buckling and avoid treating that at all. What you also notice is the images isn't great because you were imaging with basically a toned down therapy energy. So it was like 2 MV. And at that, you don't see bone very well. But it was, you could always see the prostate. Big improvement. It was an expensive machine. It was somewhat unreliable. We just recently got rid of ours because it had lived its useful life and we didn't think that technology was the way we should go forward with. This is up in Westchester. And this, but you can see, kind of you get it to pucker up here, avoid some of the rectum. This is a coronal view. And this is the sagittal. And you can see that the back of the rectal wall is pretty well spared. Also, the other thing you notice is, what's this? That stool in the rectum. We didn't really care. In photon treatment, we don't really care what's in the rectum. That's going to change with protons. This is the newest, probably, this is called a true beam. This is the current technology from very nonlinear accelerator. So what you notice immediately is the picture's much better. So you get a diagnostic quality CT scan before every treatment. And you get the same ability. So if you were treated day 1, and day 3 it's up here, they just make these images on the screen overlap perfectly, and then the table automatically moves. Yeah, Tom?
I think I'm losing. Are you talking about proton beam now?
No, this is all regular radiation treatment.
So
this is IMRT now.
42 treatments or so.
Yeah, and that's what you do. Every day you get a CT, every day you line it up.
All right.
Thanks, we didn't make that clear. But the thing you'll notice is that actually the confirmation isn't quite as good as what we got on the Tomo unit, but it's still very good. This machine is just much more adaptable to treat all tumors, not just. The Tomo was a great machine for treating head and neck cancer, and prostate, it took a little bit longer. The throughput wasn't as great. The economics really just didn't work out, and it was unreliable. So here's where we are, and that's kind of what, if you came to Westchester, this is how we would treat your prostate cancer. Now, I'm an old implant guy, so I had to put up the implant and show you that actually as conformal treatments go, it's tough to beat a good implant. So this is, you know how we had the 20 and the 30% lines, the 50% lines way out here? Well, that's what these are. And the reason you can do that is you're accepting a much higher inhomogeneity within the prostate. So there's areas in this prostate next to a seed that are getting twice the dose that you're prescribing to. But it's still a very effective way to treat prostate cancer. And then going back, now we're back to protons. And you can see a very tight conformality here. But before you think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, every day for 8 weeks, we put a balloon up there. And we blow it up. And we make sure that whatever is in the rectum is totally reproducible. Because if it is not, the proton beam doesn't see air like it sees normal tissue. So if you have a big air bubble wherever it is, if you think this beam is going to come through and stop here, it's going to stop there. So you have to be very careful about fluid shifts, air shifts, so it makes treatment of abdominal tumors very difficult because you're always going through bowel and there's always air there. You got to be really careful with prostate. The early prostate treatments, they didn't have onboard imaging. So they would just use fiducials and try to come close. Yes?
And that previous slide, is that similar to cyberknife?
No.
That one?
No, the one we have the implants?
Those are seeds. Those are iodine seeds.
That's different.
That's different. So I don't do CyberKnife, but CyberKnife is basically a very, very conformal IMRT. The limitation of CyberKnife is that, and it's an artificial one, is that you got to be treated within, I believe, 5 treatments. Mm-hmm. And that's a billing issue. There's no reason that technically you couldn't do a CyberKnife treatment for 7 weeks, but you can't get reimbursed for it. So therefore it's not done. It's a very, And it's an expensive treatment, and it's time consuming. Not quite as expensive as protons, but it's. And again, so. And then if you talk about this is kind of like if you were talking about passive scattering, and what we do now with pencil beam. You'll see that the contour, it's very, very close, but the contour around the prostate is just a little better. There just isn't quite as much tissue. Does that make any clinical difference to anybody in this room? We don't know. We have not proven that. And insurance companies want proof. They're going to say, because what's the cost of this? I'm going to hazard a guess.
$35, $40.
60, 125,000.
Probably 100 is a good place to start. So what's an IMRT course of radiation cost?
42.
Right, and these are like prices on the car at the auto dealership. There's what we charge, what we get is a different story, what you negotiate with insurance companies, but it's that kind of magnitude of difference. So you really have to prove that this isn't just pretty pictures. You have to prove that a year afterwards, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, that this person has a real advantage of having this treatment. And we haven't proven that. And if you look at the proton treatments, start off treating a lot of prostate, not so much anymore. Because the insurance companies have figured it out that they don't think it's worth it. So what we are given charge to do at the Proton Center is we're trying to negotiate with insurance companies on multiple sites and say we will collect the data and we will prove to you what's a benefit and what isn't. And we only treat what's benefit, but you got to give us the leeway to get the data. Because if you don't pay us for these treatments, we can't collect the data for you. And what's going to happen is that you'll have technology spillover. You won't prove what's good and what's not, and we're going to waste a lot of resources. And that's kind of where we are right now. Yes?
So in your preliminary, do you have like a parametric MRI to see the cancer in the prostate? So the proteins?
Not currently. But that's one of the things, now that, and we're getting off a little bit of a tangent, but now that we have the ability with endorectal coils to visualize where we think the tumor is in the prostate, you could, instead of having this all homogeneous, if you know the tumor is right there, why not put the high dose there? With this pencil beam proton, you can do that. You can give this 50% more while the rest of the prostate gets a dose that we would give a low risk zone. So we do that in a lot of other tumors, where we treat areas where we know there's disease and we give it the highest dose. Where we think there might be disease, it gets a lower dose. Maybe 80% of what we, basically to cover microscopic disease.
How do you determine whether it's high or low?
Well, we don't know yet. That's why it's research. We got a big toy that we don't know how to use, and we have to figure out how to use it. And in this environment that we're in, we have to figure out how to use it so that you get a cost benefit that's within what else we do in medicine for cost benefit.
Hasn't Loma Linda had this for years?
They have had it for years, but they did not have the imaging. They do not have the pencil beam scanning. Because Loma Linda probably has the longest history of treating prostate cancer, but it's all old technology. And so the answer is, what can this technology do? Because if you compare, I would imagine, if you compared to what Loma Linda was doing 20 years ago, I think they've had protons that long, and compared it to a good IMRT plan of Linux, I guarantee the IMRT plan will be better. Because everything's better now. Everything is better imaged. We know where the prostate is within your body. We hit the target 100% of the time. I think we do. We didn't used to do that. I went to a Proton meeting last year, and I was kind of new to it. I thought I'd learn stuff, and then someone said, how many people image the patient once a week? And I was like, oh my God, I would never do this if I couldn't image the patient every day. You're much better off doing IMRT with daily imaging than assuming where this is. It's really not that it's important to the prostate, but they're treating head and neck tumors where sometimes the sinus is full of fluid and some weren't. And these guys are from all the big institutions. You have Memorial Sloan Kettering, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and you get the technology that you have. So right now we've got great technology.
who knows, in 3 or 4 years, maybe our Cadillac won't look so good. But right now, it's pretty
None of
good.
the other guys were doing the daily imaging that you were?
Not 20 years ago. They
Oh,
couldn't.
okay, right.
There wasn't cone beam radiation that long ago. So what you were left with is you either had to put a fiducial in and pray that that marker didn't move over 7 weeks, or you had to rely on, get a CT scan, establish some bony landmarks, and then have kind of a crude, X-ray machine in the room. But this is just, there's just really no comparison. I mean, I would feel better using this. I'm not sure if I would, and I've been to a lot of technology improvements, and you always look back thinking, oh my God, can't believe what we did 20 years ago. But it was the best we had. Well, now this is the best we have. And it's pretty good. Yes?
Do you have any data on sexual function after proton therapy versus IMRT versus implants
No.
versus surgery?
But I guarantee it's probably not going to be any different. Because what you have to look at is that what's the target that you have to spare for preserving sexual function? It's probably the neurovascular bundle, and we don't know how to miss that and not miss tumor. Now, maybe if we get really good with endorectal MRs and we pick zones inside the prostate, say that needs to be high dose. This is important for sexual function. We'll come to you and say, sir, we think we've got a 95% chance of controlling your tumor, but your impotence rate is going to be X. If you want us to improve that, we can try to avoid these structures, and we think we can come close to that 95%, but you're going to have to accept that risk that it won't be as good as it could be. There'll be trade-offs. And the trade-offs won't be so bad once we get the data, but before that, if we tell you we know exactly what the outcomes are going to be, we wouldn't be telling the truth. So you have to accept the uncertainty. So, I wanted to put up some data about proton beam therapy. This is from Jacksonville, University of Florida. This is their data. And the red is low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. Say, oh, that looks pretty good. That is what you would get with any other treatment modality with prostate cancer. Whether you SEED, whether you use IMRT, whether you use surgery, whether you use watchful waiting. At 5 years, this is what you're going to see. So we need long-term data. When I'm teaching my residents, and this is a summation of kind of all the places that have kept really good data. They did it prospectively. In other words, they started, okay, we're going to treat these patients. There's no comparison arm, but we're going to treat these patients, and we're going to collect the data from the start so there'll be no bias going forward. You can see they look pretty good. They have a local biological control rate in low intermediate 99%. Their GI and GU toxicities are very low. But what's going to sell this, I always tell my residents that unless you have 10-year data in prostate cancer, it doesn't mean anything. Because everybody does good in 10 years of this risk group. Now, we're not talking about Gleason 8, 9s, and 10s, but for these low risk and lower intermediate risk, they do very well. And that's kind of who they started with, because you always want to start with a group of patients that you think are